Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce you to Richard Ladle. Richard has been we've been collaborators since like 20 years, no, perhaps 20, almost 20 years now, since we were both at the UK. He did his undergrad in zoology in Newcastle in the very early 90s. And he got his PhD in evolutionary ecology in Oxford in 1993. He worked later on. He worked on several universities around the UK, and then he moved to be the first director of the MSc in Biodiversity Conservation and Management at Oxford University, which he held for several years until he moved to Brazil in 2009, first to the Federal University of Viçosa, and since 2011, at the Federal University of Alagoas in the coast. Since 2015, he's a full professor there. But between 2020 and 2023, he was the ERA chair in tropical biodiversity at CBO of the University of Porto. And Richard is he'll explain himself, but he's got a very interdisciplinary interest about conservation, biogeography, and human-nature interaction. So, Richard, please.
Muchas gracias. Which anymore? That's enough. When I arrived here a couple of weeks ago, the first thing that Joachim did was to give me this book on failure. I hope that's not a prediction, but we shall see. I will talk about failure again several times during this presentation. This is the question I ask myself every time I wake up. Joachim has already explained who I am. Why am I here? We have an international cooperation grant funded by CNPq in Brazil. So I'm here for the next 2 months to talk, discuss, and hopefully advance a project where we're looking at global shortfalls in biodiversity knowledge, which I will also talk about today. These are my books, if anyone wants to buy them. Very welcome. The structure of the presentation. Okay, this is going to be a bit of a strange presentation because it's actually 3 presentations that I'm crushing together into a single narrative. Each presentation normally takes 45 minutes, so this is going to be a bit of a gallop through the last 20 years of my research. So what I want to do is, first of all, I want to talk about the problem of shortfalls in biodiversity knowledge. And then I want to talk about 2 different ways that we might be able to start filling some of these shortfalls using data which isn't normally used for this purpose. And then finally end up with some conclusions. So continuing with the theme of let's go quickly, I want to start by talking about the ignorance problem in global conservation. We have 2 major issues for me in conservation. The first one is that we're having to make decisions based on very, very little data often. And even for some dimensions of biodiversity where we have a lot of data, there's still lots of holes in the data and lots of biases in the data. If you think about, we have documented 2 million species, more or less, and how many species exist undocumented? Difficult to know. Most scientists put it in the range of 8 to 12 million. So even something that we have a good handle on, we still have lots of holes in our knowledge. And the other problem is lack of resources, because actually it's difficult to collect biodiversity data. We need specialists. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of expertise for many types of biodiversity data. So bearing that in mind, I started discussing this with Joachim, as he said, maybe 20 years ago we started discussing it. And in 2015, we got together at my house on the beach in Brazil to think about this. And we'd been invited to write a paper for annual reviews of ecology and evolution. And what we decided to do is we wanted to classify the types of biodiversity ignorance that existed. And we came up with 7 forms of ignorance, which we, at the time, we were very pleased about. Ignorance about the identity of species, ignorance about the distribution of species, lack of knowledge about populations, lack of knowledge about the tree of life and evolution of species, lack of knowledge of the traits of species, lack of knowledge of the abiotic tolerances, abiotic niche of species, and lack of knowledge of ecological interactions between species. This paper was a tremendous success. We've had nearly 2,000 citations of it. It was also a tremendous failure because it was the type of failure that I think we all want to have, yeah? Lots and lots of people really liked the idea and were inspired by it, but also lots of people pointed out, hang on a sec, what about this type of biodiversity knowledge? Surely that deserves to be a shortfall as well. What about this sort of knowledge? And I did the biggest head slap I think I've ever done in my career. I was literally reading the paper again the day it was published. I worked for many years, and still work, on human biodiversity interactions. Our Eltonian shortfall on species interactions, we didn't mention humans at all. So we had one major dimension of biodiversity knowledge that we had basically put under the rug. And lots of people pointed this out, along with other forms as well. So what are we doing? We're currently, the reason I'm here, going back to that, is we're currently doing a revised framework where we're trying to fill in some of the details. This will also be a failure. That's what this excellent book actually tells us, is that science is about failing better. And this will be a failure as well. But I think we're moving, this is going to be a better failure than our previous failure. There were 3 new shortfalls, categories of shortfalls that we think are very important. There's a lack of knowledge about genetic sequences and genome of species, which again, we didn't really think about in our first iteration. And we've identified 2 aspects of human biodiversity interactions that we feel are important dimensions of biodiversity knowledge that we're missing. That's the lack of knowledge how biodiversity contributes to human societies and cultures, and the lack of knowledge about humans' impact biodiversity. Okay. There's been a lot of research on these different biodiversity shortfalls. Most research, interestingly, has focused on our lack of knowledge of distribution of species. I'm going to talk about this more because I think this is the one place where there's actually a lot of knowledge out there that we're not using. And the question that I'm going to try to answer, is there a way for us to tap into this knowledge? Okay, are we using all the available data? I was thinking about this at around the same time we started to develop the shortfalls framework. That is, the internet at that time, the mid-2010s, was expanding rapidly. It was penetrating into lots of countries where it had previously been relatively little used. And people were really, really sad. That was the kind of dawn of the age of people posting nauseous amounts of information about their personal lives online. So I thought, well, maybe if the internet is a mirror of the real world, perhaps we can use that in order to extract information about the real world. Of course, that's the famous monkey selfie picture. But that's a biodiversity data point, if it has associated metadata with it. The monkey selfie, if it's geo-referenced with a timestamp, that's a biodiversity data point that we could use as information. So this is the idea. Can we use this sort of accidental biodiversity data to increase our knowledge of various aspects of biodiversity? And before I start on this, I like to think about this as another type of citizen science data. But it's a very strange sort of citizen science data. You can, I like to classify citizen science in two gradients. The level of direction by scientists, that's how much we as scientists are actually trying to mold the type of data that citizens collect, and the intention of citizens to collect biodiversity data. So you can think of an online initiative such as Zooniverse, for example, as having a very high level of direction and a very high level of intention. Citizens actively want to contribute to a scientific project. Something like eBird is a bit different. Scientists created a system to collect biological data, but citizens don't necessarily use it for that purpose. I mean, I know a lot of bird watchers who use eBird to help them with their birding, to make the birding more enjoyable to them. So there's not a huge intention of most bird watchers to collect data for the GBIF, but that's what they're doing. And what I became really interested in is these sets of data that we weren't tapping into at all. This is like a Facebook group for people who like to photograph butterflies. They have no intention whatsoever to collect data for science. There may be scientists in that group, but that's not the purpose of the Facebook group. Or somebody who goes on holiday and sees a butterfly and thinks, that's pretty. Take a picture, upload it onto my Instagram page. That's a biological data point, if we can get it. So this was a paper led by one of my colleagues, Ivan Jarek, in University of Paris. And he put all of these ideas together, and we framed it in terms of what we called iEcology, internet ecology. This is extracting data about ecological phenomena from the internet where the data is created for other purposes. It's not created for science. And the idea is that there's a pathway. You have data on the internet in text, images, videos, sounds, online activity, and metadata. You can use automated web crawlers, AI, natural language processing, in order to extract knowledge on occurrences, traits, phenology, functional roles, behavior, and this allows you to draw ecological insights. So let's go back to our shortfalls and see whether we can use iEcology to fill some of these shortfalls. This is a study by another one of my colleagues in Barcelona, Valerio I'm not going to even pronounce his name. He's Italian. Let's leave it at that. Okay, so what Valerio has done, this is the coolest job in the world for somebody like me who likes to fish, is he watches videos of people fishing. And he was studying the white grouper, and here, the black triangles are GBIF data points. And the colored circles are YouTube video data points. And you can see that he has managed to track occurrences of the white grouper further north. And these data points here basically weren't covered by the GBIF. So he's shown that you can use videos of fishermen to collect data that fills in holes in the GBIF dataset. Another example. This is a study I've done with Shawan Chowdhury, I think he's currently in Australia now. He used a Facebook page in Bangladesh based on, the Facebook page was people interested in butterflies. And what we did is we used the GBIF data and the GBIF data plus Facebook data to model important areas for conservation. So we plugged the extra data into the standard model for identifying an important conservation area. And we found that there were several places in Bangladesh. And remember here, we're talking about Bangladesh. We're not talking about Spain, where you've got 95% of the population on the internet. This is a country that we would normally have thought of where maybe internet penetrance is much less. And you might think that there's much fewer potential data sources. But here we managed to actually change where we might think about doing conservation by including data from Facebook. And it's not just at the level of a single country. You can do this for whole regions. And this is what we did for a species, the tawny costa butterfly, which is slowly expanding its distribution. And the orange data points are GBIF data points. The blue data points are from social media, Instagram, Facebook. And again, you can see here in India, and here's that level of geography. Is that Thailand? I think that's Thailand. In Indonesia, we're seeing several areas that aren't covered by the GBIF, but which are covered by data from social media. Okay, can use it for other things as well. Not all the shortfalls you can get information, this sort of information for, but things like the traits shortfall. This is a phenological example from John Mittermeier. So this is people looking at Wikipedia web pages for bird species. And these are migratory bird species in the United States. So you can trace when birds are arriving through when people look at the Wikipedia page for that species. It's not a very good way of measuring phenology, but it gives you an idea, a general idea. And this is for tropical species where there's no seasonal patterns. This is a much more quantitative example. These are images from Google Images of a hybrid zone between the hooded crow and the carrion crow in Europe. Imagine if you were trying to do this as a researcher. If I gave this project to a PhD student, okay, I want you to recreate the hybrid zone for hooded crows and carrion crows in Europe. How on earth would you do that? I mean, apart from spending a fortune in traveling, it would take you an immense amount of time to build up this sort of picture. But they're able to use Google Images to trace the hybrid zone between these two subspecies. Another example is behavioral traits, which could be considered as a separate subcategory of shortfalls, and several people have suggested this. So this was a paper looking at grey squirrels and red squirrels in different habitats and looking at different behavioral traits and how they relate to each other, all based upon videos that the public had posted on YouTube. The Eltonian shortfall, the interactions shortfall, again, it's limited, but there are some things that it's very good for the internet. This is one of the examples. People go on safari in Africa. They like to take pictures of big mammals. Big mammals often have birds associated with them. And this is the network of mammal-bird interactions based upon people's photos from when they go on safari. And you can see the coverage of this more or less follows where people go on safari. Kruger Park, Etosha, Rift Valley parks. So you can build up a very, very complex picture of the interactions between birds and mammals. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about that sort of accidental data. And now let's go on to the other part of the presentation, which is accidental data on human nature interactions. And this is where the internet should be really good at reflecting these sort of interactions. Not only interactions, but also attitudes and interest in biodiversity. I don't know why he's hugging the panda, that's weird. Okay, so we said one of the missing shortfalls from our first framework was lack of knowledge about how biodiversity contributes to human societies and cultures. I told you that I used to study this. So me and my colleague Paul Jepson in the mid-2000s, we had a huge project going on in Indonesia. We were interested in how Indonesians relate to and interact with wild and captive bird species. For those of you who have been to Indonesia, the Indonesians are crazy about birds. Yeah, it's like a national passion. They have bird singing competitions, which are like football matches. I couldn't believe it the first time I went there. People screaming and shouting for their favorite birds. The top trainers of birds are famous in Indonesia. It is a crazy culture. So we wanted to know what was the extent of this passion. What was the extent of bird keeping in Indonesia? We did a survey of 2,000 households throughout urban Indonesia. It was an absolute bloody nightmare. It was so difficult. We had piles of data on pieces of paper. The whole thing was incredibly complicated and difficult. And at the end of the day, it's still a tiny sample of Indonesians. So this is really, really hard work, collecting this sort of data. Based on that, I became really interested in the mid-2010s. Maybe we can extract this data in a different way. And again, going back to accidental data on the internet, we suggested that we can use Culturomics, which is a quantitative analysis of culture based on big data in digital databases. So the sort of things we can measure are things like salience, which is the volume of representations, interest, which is how people interact with those representations, and sentiment, how people feel about representations, and not just representations of biodiversity, but representations of conservation, of protected areas, many aspects of the real physical world. So I want to take you through an example. This took us 10 years to work out, and I'm going to take you through it in about 5 minutes. So it's going to be a very broad-based. We went down lots of blind alleys. We made lots of mistakes. Spain caused us lots of trouble, and I will explain why soon. So, for instance, we wanted to know, can we measure the salience and interest in species based upon how often they're mentioned on the internet? Seems simple, eh? So, our first challenge was language, which is that there's a lot of languages in the world. A single species can have more than one common name, and some species have names that mean different things. The teal, which is this duck, is also a color of paint. If you put teal into the internet, you will find it's the most populous bird species in the world, which it obviously isn't. Okay, so we thought, hang on a sec, Latin is a dead language. People don't use it anymore. If there's a relationship between Latin names and common names, then maybe we can use Latin names and we've got our proxy. So we did this. This is the name in Latin. This is the name in English. And we have a nice, strong correlation. Great, we can use Latin names. But we thought, well, let's test it on other languages, because English isn't the only language in the world, much that the English like to think it is. So we did a study. We looked at different languages. And we found that in different countries with different languages, we were getting the same pattern, except for Spain, that has a relationship like that instead of like that. Can you guess what mistake we made? We looked at Latin names and common names. No, Spain has more than one language. We looked at Castilian names. So when you add the other languages in, the relationship goes to the same as the other ones. I'll tell you the other thing. What is the most well-known bird in the world based on Latin names? You will not guess this, but if I tell you, maybe you will work out the mistake we made. The most salient bird in the world is the European magpie. Latin name? Pica pica. Also the name for many restaurants in Spain. Which screwed up the analysis again. So, Spain. Right. So what drives these differences in salience? Because it's not enough to know that there's a difference. We need to understand what's driving it. Is it meaningful from a cultural perspective? So this is a paper we did in People and Nature. And we found that there were actually lots of things that correlated strongly with salience of birds on the internet. First of all, we found years known to science was a strong correlate. And that's understandable, isn't it? The first taxonomists named the things that they knew well. And the things that they knew well are the things that we still know well. So you'd guess, they took the low-hanging fruit. So the low-hanging fruit are the things that we know. That's interesting. Caged birds have high salience, and domestic birds, chickens. Most famous bird in the world is actually the chicken. It's kind of obvious. Game birds, also very high. Birds in urban areas. Why? Because you have to know something to love it. So birds in urban areas, we all see them. They're much more likely to be represented on the internet. And birds with increasing populations, and I think these things, those are probably interactions there, is that birds that are increasing are the birds that can live with humans. So again, it all seems to be going in the same direction, and there is an element of, I guess we would call this an artifact, is that birds that you find in countries with lots of internet users have higher salience. So birds here are very widespread birds that you find all across the world. Birds down here are in countries with very low web penetrance, such as Papua New Guinea. Okay, so we're struggling to publish this paper at the moment, but based on that, we've come up with a model for digital biodiversity. And the idea is that you have two feedback loops. You have people who encounter birds in their life, in the physical world and are motivated by this because of the value that these interactions cause to create digital content. You also have people who interact with representations of biodiversity, and based on these interactions in the digital world, are motivated to create digital content. So you have two feedback loops. What's interesting is if you follow some of the papers of Kevin Gaston and Soga, they're saying that we have a problem of extinction of experience in the world. So this feedback loop is weakening, and we would predict that this feedback loop, where content generates more content, is strengthening. And a prediction of this, that we haven't tested yet, is that we will get higher inequality of representation in the future. Things that are well represented will become even more represented in the future due to this feedback loop. We can take the same approach of culturomics to model scientific interest in species. We did this for mammals using conservation journals. The most scientifically interesting mammal species is the wild boar. Probably one of the things you'll notice here is these species are by no means the most threatened species of mammal. There's a big bias in conservation science towards well-known, culturally important species. So it seems that cultural importance is driving conservation research as much as conservation need, is what we argued in this paper. We can also map this. So in the same way as we can create a map of species richness, we can use these indices of public interest to weight species richness maps in order to create a map of interest. We did this last year based upon reads of Wikipedia pages for mammals. So we created an index based on how many times a Wikipedia page had been read. We can do this for different languages, and then we can map public interest of species based on different languages. That's a map of mammal species richness. This is a map of public interest based upon reads of Spanish websites, Spanish Wikipedia pages. What's interesting is Spanish and Portuguese show quite similar patterns. German shows a totally different pattern. Why? Because there are no Germans in South America. Whereas there are lots of Spanish speakers. No, I lied. Of course there were Germans in South America. There's just not very many of them. Let's be technically correct, at least. There are not very many German speakers in South America, which is really interesting. So you could also do a global map of scientific interest. That's something that we're thinking of doing. In fact, you can map all different forms of interest. If you can measure interest, then you can map it. So depending which digital corpora you use to generate interest, you can map different dimensions, different types of cultural interest. This is a work in progress. Everyone remember the pandemic when we were all stuck in our houses forever, as it seemed? A lot of people had nothing to do apart from look out their windows. This line here represents lockdown. This line here represents the number of searches on Google for these different urban bird species. And the line here represents the average numbers of searches for the same time period in non-pandemic years. You can see a really, really strong pattern. So we could see a change in cultural behavior, a change in interest in nature caused by the pandemic. Interesting. We struggled to find how we could exploit, how we could use that, but it shows that you can monitor changes, and changes can occur quite rapidly in cultural interest. How does this relate to conservation? I published a paper last year where we were arguing that perhaps the red list could be supported by other sorts of data. And the idea is this: if we take a critically endangered species, all things being equal, if that critically endangered species has a low level of scientific knowledge and a low level of cultural salience, then it is more threatened than one that doesn't. Why? Because we need scientific knowledge to make the most effective conservation choices, and we need cultural interest to mobilize support for conservation. So we could potentially use these culturomic indices as ways to help us to identify which species really require governmental support, maybe as opposed to support from conservation NGOs, which are more tied to public interest. Okay, conclusions. If the internet is a mirror of society, it's a fairground mirror. Yeah, there are biases in internet data, and we know that. If you're interested in the attitudes and knowledge of indigenous populations, the internet is not the place to look for that sort of information. Internet geographies can bias macro-scale studies that we showed in the big bird study. Many companies are not willing to share raw data. Take a Meta, limiting the analysis that we can do. And we've tried to collaborate with these companies. They're not really interested in that, as you might expect. Because of this, data can be deleted, can be moved or censored. Access can be limited. We've been trying, Instagram is a classic case of this. Every year they change the API, the regulations for getting data. And the data, it's big data. It's a different paradigm. We can't really test hypotheses. We're looking for correlations. The data's noisy, messy, unstructured. So it's a different sort of level of evidence and proof that we're looking for. And not all shortfalls will benefit from internet data. Linnaean shortfall requires taxonomists. The internet has turned up a couple of new species. There was a species of sundew found on Facebook a couple of years ago. A couple of fish species have been found in markets, but it's unusual. Okay, the future. Increasing automation, possibly through AI. And I'm hoping that sometime in the future we're going to be able to formalize these methods so that there's a pipeline of these methods into the GBIF and into conservation policy. We published a paper last year on how such a pipeline might work: collection of data, filtering, extraction, quality check, harmonization, where we can get these, where we can have a almost real-time pipeline of biodiversity data being entered into big databases that are available to all scientists. We can also, AI is changing how we collect data. So one of my postdocs who's actually arriving here next week, Felipe Vieira, did this paper where he was looking at cultural ecosystem services based upon photographs. This is the northeast coast of Brazil, all 2,000 kilometers of it. What he did is he used an existing AI, Google Cloud Vision, to analyze each photo and to describe the photo in words, and then we converted the words into cultural ecosystem services. It works well, but it's quite messy. Another paper I did with Ana Sofia Cardoso in Porto is we built and trained our own AI to do this. That was great, except when we tried to apply it to a different protected area, it didn't work very well. So you can have a general AI that works well but which is messy, or a specific AI that you've trained on a very tight data source which can't be scaled up. So, there are natural limitations to this. There are methods that are being developed where we might be able to link the AI into more general LLM models to improve identification outside of the area of training. But these are still in very early stages of development. I don't know whether you've come across these. If you've got a spare 5,000 euros, you can buy one. Swarovski have just brought out binoculars which are linked into the Merlin AI identification system. You click the button, and the name of the bird you're looking at comes up in the binoculars and is uploaded into the GBIF through eBird. How long before all of us have AI glasses which we just need to ask them? So imagine you're walking down the street, you see a butterfly, you don't know what it is, and you say, Alexa, what's this? It identifies it and uploads the data into the GBIF. I think 5 years. That's going to be a reality. And for people like us, who love these things, I think it's going to be brilliant. Yeah? Amazing. Of course, Meta will know where you are at any given point in time, but I think it's a small price to pay. So, I presented the data from two big networks of people. There's the shortfall network, Joaquim, Zay, various people. There's the Culturomics network, particularly Ricardo Correa and Ricardo Menin were very important in the development of this. Ivan Jarek for iEcology and Uriol, Valerio. I also need to thank CMPQ for funding me and FAPL. My research group is the Ana Malhado, who's got her finger in everything. She's also my wife, so if I... God. Sorry, Anna. Anna is the co-director of our lab in Alagoas. LACOS 21, the Laboratorio de Conservação do Século XXI. So our objective is to look at new technologies and how we might be able to use them to enhance conservation and ecology. My email is here. I am here 2 months. If you want to come and talk to me, I'm always available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Hello. Yeah. Thanks a lot for the really interesting talk. My name is Ana Benitez, and I will probably hit you up while you're here to have a chat. I have several questions, but I think the first one that I would like to know your opinion about is from all the shortfalls that you and Joaquin listed in your first 2015 paper, what's your feeling about how well we're doing for each of them, if we are kind of minimizing the knowledge gaps for specific shortfalls more than for others, and where we should put more efforts into? Yeah, and if there's somebody working into trying to monitor progress towards this.
That's a really, really good question. And actually, we don't have a fantastic handle on this. I think one thing that we can say is that some shortfalls, we have a much more systematic system in place for evaluating them. And some shortfalls don't even have global databases. And I think that's an issue that, for instance, species interactions, we are we're decades off having good information. Even for, and you know, this goes for ecological interactions certainly, but also human nature interactions as well. It horrifies me that zoonosis could cause another pandemic, yet we have no global database on what people hunt, what people eat, what people sell. We have information. We have good specific information for some places, but you know, we don't have that sort of information at the level that we need in order to develop good policies for that. I think the other problem is we have a fundamental constraint on shortfalls, and that is one of the fundamental shortfalls, the Linnaean shortfall. I'm not going to go into a rant about how taxonomy needs to get its act together in a museum. I'm certainly not going to say that in a museum, but we haven't reached taxonomic stability for most groups. And I'm saying that in the sense of there's still huge amounts of taxonomic reorganization going on. If you go back 20 years, we had 2,000 less species of birds. These 2,000 species are not new discoveries. This is taxonomic reorganization. So until we get taxonomic stability, it's going to be very difficult to fill the other shortfalls because they're all dependent upon a stable taxonomy. We've just developed 2 papers, one looking at taxonomic uncertainty and one looking at the factors causing misidentification. And of course, both taxonomic uncertainty and misidentification influence our ability to measure other shortfalls. So I guess I'd say it like that. We have global databases and pretty good information for Wallacean, Vancarian, the trait shortfall, and the population shortfall. The other shortfalls, and of course, Linnaean shortfall, we have good global databases. The other shortfalls, they're still very much behind, I think, in terms of a global infrastructure. How we're going to, what the constraints are, the limitations, the impediments, we're still trying to sort those out. We're failing bigger with the next iteration, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for the talk. Among many questions, just one. Should we, as scientists, influence the cultural salience in that? I'm thinking, for instance, tardigrades, right? At some point, nobody knew about tardigrades. Then they were put in internet, and they were the funny-looking gambers that everybody loves. And I think if you stop people in the street, they may know what's a tardigrade, but may know nothing else about other invertebrates. So I wonder if there should be some assessment of how much cultural salience is among groups and whether part of the conservation should be boosting groups that are neglected. It's a tricky question. But
That's a great question. And it's really interesting because I think you have to ask yourself, are there kind of limits of cultural attention? You know, how many species can the public be interested in? How much room is there for public interest in species? The other thing is that the public don't see species the way we see them. Yeah, we see them very much biologically as species. They see them as cultural species. So often, you know, for the public, a beetle is a beetle. Yeah, there's nothing more than the beetle. There's not the 700,000 beetles that we see. So that's also interesting as well. But I think you're absolutely right. That by measuring cultural salience, we can identify the ugly, the unloved, the species that nobody is interested in. And then we, I think, have some responsibility to say, okay, well, we need to step in. to conserve them. There might be opportunities for new types of flagship species. But it's, again, you know, normally the flagship species are things that have historically embedded within cultures. And then we've got other places in the world where there are no people, like Antarctica. And that's going to be very difficult because the cultural connection with those species is missing. Having said that, species that don't exist can have very high salience. Bigfoot, the Yeti, or species that are extinct, like the dodo. We're currently doing a study looking at the cultural salience of dinosaurs using Culturomics. And we have a model that we're going to test for that. Can anyone guess what we think the main factor will be determining public interest in dinosaur species? Absolutely right. So we have a metric for whether they appear in the Jurassic Park series and how much screen time they have. And we're going to put that into our model of public interest in dinosaurs.
Very, very interesting. So I am going to make a question in relation with my background. So I want to say I'm a microbiologist, and I want to know if you think that this can have any utility also for our work, because in this case the identification is not so easy. And
okay, so yes, I think taxonomists actually have one of the most essential roles within this new frontier of biodiversity evaluation, because we need, as I was saying, we need good identifications. We can use artificial intelligence to help us, but at the same time, the training of the artificial intelligence, the validation, all relies on strong taxonomy and strong taxonomic expertise. One of the big things that myself and Joaquim are going to be talking about the next couple of weeks is, can we measure taxonomic capacity across the world? Because this is a major impediment to collecting biodiversity data. So, you know, what are the metrics? How can we measure the number of taxonomic experts? How geographically localized are they? Can we measure where taxonomic papers are being published, which taxa are being studied, in order to create an index, an impediment index? Where are the gaps in taxonomic knowledge and expertise in the world? And how does that influence our knowledge of biodiversity? I don't think that's answered your question, but it's kind of it's as close as I can get.
Thank you very much for the talk, and thank you very much for the energy. I have a question that was generated during your talk. I liked a lot the fact that you mentioned this mirror, that the internet is a mirror, a reflection of reality. But talking about AI, that brings a question in my head that AI, apart from, it's not just a statistical tool that we can use. Nowadays, it also generates text and generates images. And it becomes even more difficult to realize what's reality and what's not. So how do you think that, from a technical point of view, how is going to be treated now and maybe in the future? Because, for example, one thing that we can do is, I guess, filter out occurrences that are outside of native ranges, but that falls in the Wallacean shortfall, right?
Yeah.
So it's a dead-end loop. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, well, there's going to be a couple of things. That we're going to need, if I can go back to that, we're going to need really good filtering of our data, because we're going to have to try to correct for the fact that internet content is increasingly created by bots. The other thing, which is kind of horrifying to an extent, is this loop that might not be a person. And we've had big discussions about this, and we're moving from looking at salience, looking at content, to looking at how people interact with content to ensure that we're dealing with people rather than things. So Wikipedia page reads are quite good for that, because that's somebody that's actually opened the Wikipedia page to look at it. It's not a bot. So we've kind of shifted a little bit in the focus. When we started this in the mid-2010s, we didn't have that problem. Yeah. So it's a new problem, and this is the thing, it's continually evolving, this system. It's one of the constraints of it. But again, a brilliant question. The answer is yes, we are aware of it. Yes, we're trying to deal with it. No, we haven't solved the problem of it. And I worry, because this idea that you might get biases in the information that's available to us on the web, bots are going to accelerate this. So the inequality of representation, we might end up with an internet that is just full of panda and tiger photos in the future because that's what people like. And that's what AIs are feeding on and feeding into the system.
So what AI is producing can be an indicator of salience, right?
It is, but it's an indicator of salience now. Yeah, and is that going to just be embedded in the system forever? So it's, really, really important questions. And if we have the extinction of experience, the end of this map, then people's interest in nature and conservation is going to be increasingly influenced by where we are now, the bots.
I think we can take one more. We can take one more from Luis, and yeah.
Just a small comment with this loop. There's also the possibility, because there's digital image generation and they're becoming more and more realistic. It's so to the point that you cannot tell. For instance, there's a video of a bear fighting a cat, but that video is AI generated, and there's plenty of them in internet nowadays. Lots of videos of animal interactions that are completely AI generated, because that's what they sell, basically, no? They get reactions. And there's going to be a point where we cannot tell apart if that's real data we can use from made-up videos.
Yeah, and I think there will also be a point that we're really close to now, where this experience of going out in nature can be recreated by AI. So you want to go to the jungle in Borneo, you can sit back in your hot bath, stick your virtual reality goggles on, and you will get that experience. It won't be exactly the same, but it will be close. And that is going to, again, influences the type of value generated, and it's going to influence the way that we value nature, which is going to influence conservation. So yeah, I think it's, again, great comment, really perceptive.
Just sort of in response to that, I think it's really interesting that you had that big spike in people searching for urban birds on Wikipedia when people couldn't do anything else apart from sit in their houses, and actually they weren't on the internet, they were looking out the window at what birds. So by actually restricting what people could do and all the other competing demands on our bandwidth, you can actually increase people's engagement with nature.
Yeah, I thought this was fascinating, and actually we published 2 papers about the people's response to the pandemic. We published this one about urban birds, and we published another one about global interest in protected areas. And global interest in protected areas fell. in every country of the world apart from Finland. Yeah? It wasn't the Spanish this time, it was the Finns. And we spent weeks talking about this. Why Finns? Why the Finns? Why the Finns? And then we spoke to some Finnish people, and we realized that the Finns had a totally different approach to the pandemic than any other country. What happened was nearly all Finnish families have country homes. And they all left the city before the lockdown to their country homes, and the country homes are next to the national parks. And the national parks remained open. So all of a sudden, in Finland, there was a spike in interest in national parks because they were constrained. They were stuck in their country homes, or cabins, I should say. They were stuck in their rural cabins. They had nothing to do apart from the only thing that was open was the national parks. Whereas all the national parks in Africa and Australia and places like that were closed, or there was no travel. So yeah, I think, again, a fascinating observation I think is really interesting is that by restricting people's movement and ability to do other things, it rekindles their interest in nature. Yeah, so I think here they're looking out the window, they were seeing things. What's this? Oh, look it up in a book or on the internet, and then they Googled it to find out more about it.
Okay, well, thanks, Richard, for the nice talk and for the nice discussion. We are going to hit the kiosk now. We are going to go down for a beer if somebody wants to continue the discussion. And remember that Richard will be here until
Until the end of December, yeah.